Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where our mission is to share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy at El Paso Community College.
And my name is Jules Simon. I'm a philosopher and teach and write at University of Texas, El Paso.
So thank you so much for joining us again today. This season we are exploring las fronteras between philosophy and other disciplines. And today we feel very grateful to be interviewing our colleague Armando Rendon, who was born in the Westside barrio of San Antonio, Texas. His first job was as a writer on a weekly newspaper as a reporter. Then in 1957, he was recruited by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights to work in its D.C. press office. He graduated from St. Mary's College in Moraga, California in 1961. In 1971, Armando published the Chicano Manifesto, the first book written about the Chicano movement and by a Chicano writer. In 1983, he earned the Juris Doctor at American University's Washington College of Law and worked pro bono with American Indian and Chicano human rights organizations throughout the 1990s. Shortly after returning to the Bay Area, he accepted a faculty position in the Collegiate Seminar Program at his alma mater. Then in 2010, he returned to writing with his focus on young adult novels. In 2013, he published the first and what became an award-winning 4-part series titled The Adventures of Noldo and His Magical Scooter. His 5th Noldo book, Wizard of the Blue Hole, was also a finalist in the 2018 International Latino Book Awards. In 2009, Rendon founded the Somos en Escrito magazine, an online literary organization. And then in 2016, he established the Somos en Escrito Literary Foundation, which now operates the magazine and the Somos en Escrito Literary Foundation Press. In 2019, Rendon released a paper titled Blueprint for the Next 50 Years, which became the basis for the creation of the Mexicanos 2070, a national organization dedicated to preserving and advancing Mexican-American culture. Armando, thank you for taking the time to meet us today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to read all that wording.
You've been active for so long. It's incredible. I aspire. I was telling Jules, I hope that I continue to stay half as active in, writing and organizing.
Founding.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think it's a question of stamina and just wanting to stay busy. I can't help it, So, but thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
It also seems like you're very inspired by what you are busy with, you in all different facets too.
It's a commitment. You've done so many things, from activism, law, but you're a writer also. And so what would you tell us? What is literature and poetry?
That's probably one of the biggest questions I could imagine right now. What is literature? What is poetry? To me, literature is basically a way of communicating truth, which happens to be one of the great values, I guess you would say, or ideas of philosophy itself. So in my own writing, which, as you mentioned, I really didn't start looking at literary writing until I retired actually I retired about 2004. I had been writing mostly for other people because I've been in public affairs and public relations, had my own PR firm for a while, so basically when I retired, my goal was to begin writing for myself, and which I think I have pretty much of a philosophical bent, and I have studied the classics and classical literature, classical philosophers. That's what St. Mary's core curriculum is based on, great books. But I think having done that, having gone through the discipline, I guess you call it, of reading these texts and discussing them and engaging with other students and professors, it gave me a tendency to think along the lines of, well, what is really happening? What can I say about it? What do I have something to say about it? And in what form? And it finally happened that I was able to retire from a 9-to-5 job and devote myself to what I was hoping would be not necessarily a career, because I was already well along in years, but that I could provide a certain perspective on life from my point of view, And I hunted around to see what I was interested in writing about, or the kind of genre I wanted to enter, And I've been reading all my life, different kinds of literature, different kinds of writings, and it wasn't until I actually started to write some things, and try detective novels, crime novels, and so I tried some poetry, and it just finally dawned on me that what I was really interested in was reaching out to young adults, young kids. And then there was a process of figuring out how that would happen. What could I write? How could I write? What could I write about? And so I was pretty introspective for a while, just trying to determine, well, I want to write, but you don't just say I want to write and then all of a sudden you start, writing stuff on paper or on the screen. It's a process, right? And at some point, and I'm not sure how it even happened, but through the process of elimination, I guess I decided that, I wanted to reach out to young kids and write YA novels, young adult novels. And it came to me that, again, the material for such writing was right in front of me, or maybe behind me, because I reached back to my own youth, my own kidhood, a character that could relate to young people, and came up with this kid named Noldo, who is the hero of the 5 novels I've written so far. And he has the first 4 books he travels it back into time, and of course that brings up a lot of questions about just the idea of time travel and having an effect on time and that sort of thing, those kind of issues. But I found that I really enjoyed it, and then it came a time when I was writing the first one that everything started to click, and the stories started to come together, and one led to another. So I guess for me, literature is a way of telling about yourself, in a way, and in this case, the different elements came together so that I was able to write what were considered, award-winning stories. But that's not what I wrote it about. I didn't write to get awards. I wanted to write just because I had something in me that said, you've got to get something out. You have some ideas, and how do you put them together and then inform other people about your point of view? I think it's pretty philosophical, you know.
Yeah, because you're imagining a certain kind of potential reader. You know, the second question is, what do you think about reading literature? So as you're writing, you have an audience in mind, right? So it's not just you reaching inside yourself for this spontaneous generation, right? You already have a young adult audience in mind as you're forming these ideas somehow in you.
I think, yeah, Jules, I think thinking about it in that sense, I think I had myself in mind as a reader.
Ah, very nice. Yeah, because the question is, you know, what do you think of reading literature and how does that affect you, right?
Well, I think in this case, I really enjoyed writing the stories,
Mm-hmm.
but I also enjoyed reading them. You know, so I guess it was kind of like self-admiration or something. I don't know, but I learned some things in writing that were quite, to me, were quite striking, quite eye-opening. It was a revelation to me that I even had these ideas, you know.
What would you say was the best part about being a writer, the writing process?
Just well, one part of it is there's many parts, I think, but one part of it is kind of working things out in your head and writing things down, perhaps, and then figuring out how things fit together. I think all of us in somewhere they're always doing that. You know, it doesn't always result in a book, but it might result in a life decision that you know, changes your direction of your life. Well, when it's I would say when the stories started to come together, the first story started to come together, it gave me a lot of confidence that I had something to say, and that this is the way to say it. I say it a lot of things through Noldo, my hero, and much of that has to do with my own people, Mexican Americans, Chicanos, how I grew up, because Noldo is growing up, you know, in the barrio. And I'm sure you know the Westside barrio.
I've heard. I don't know that I've been there, but I've heard.
Well, you got to go there.
Hueso, le dicen hueso, no?
West Side, yeah. And there's also a South Side, but they're different people. But I grew up on a little house on Ruiz Street by Sabinas, if you're ever up that way. So I had skills in writing. I also had talent in terms of turning a phrase and that sort of thing. But it's quite different, I think, when you're writing a literary type of piece, to make it you know, entertaining, to make it attractive, that people will actually keep reading it. To me, the idea of the process of writing was really illuminating it. I mean, I learned a lot about myself, and the fact that I could write, other than press releases and opinion pieces and what have you, or reports. So yeah, so it in a way it changed my life. You know, it made me it gave me something really to do, and then evolved into, you know, the next story and the third story and the fourth story. They just the later stories just kind of like almost wrote themselves. I mean, just like, you know, just came out, which was amazing when you think about it. When I think about it, that given the premise of the books, which was basically to write about a kid who's growing up and tell about the culture of that time, and the people of that time, especially in the Westside, and at the same time give a historical lesson in each book. Because you're not familiar with him, I'm sure, but in the first book, he travels back in time, thanks to his scooter,
Bicycle scooter, yeah.
to the Battle of the Alamo. He lands there through, a mechanism that I developed. A couple of days before the final assault by the Mexican army on the Alamo. And the second one, he ends up with an Irish-American buddy that he's recently made at the border of Rio Grande with American soldiers ready to cross into Mexico and invade Mexican territory, and meets up with Irish soldiers who defect, as you know the story of the San Patricio Batallón, or Batallón de San Patricio.
Right.
Yeah.
And he and his buddy, Pat, join the San Patricios. Right? And the third one, he goes back into in El Paso, ends up in El Paso, looking at the revolution that's happening right across in Juarez. One of the first battles took place in Juarez. Eventually forced Diaz, no family connection, right, to leave, abandon Mexico. And the fourth one, he ends up only about a decade or so earlier than he was born. During the time in the late 1930s, when there was a lot of labor organizing going on in San Antonio, a lot of strikes and what have you. So he plays a part in that too. You've heard of Emma Temayuca, who was a labor leader at that time, and he actually meets her. Now here's an interesting thing about writing. You never know where your sources are going to come from. Because I used a lot of my elders to find out what was going on in the 50s. All right, Temayuca was a very well-known person at that time, and even continuing into the 60s. I have an uncle who died at 101 years old. It's been about 4 years ago now. And, excuse me, one day I was on the phone with him, and I said, Tío David, Tío David, I said, did you ever know Emma Temayuca? And he says, oh yeah, we went to school together. And I almost fell off my chair, I said, oh my God. Well, and I said, because I wanted to give more of a description of what she was like and all this. And he told me about her voice. He told me about, her giving, speeches in high school assemblies and that sort of thing. And so I worked all that into the story. But I know one of your questions was about whether writing is an individual or a communal kind of thing. And this event, this incident, reminded me of that. I think for a writer, it's impossible to write as an individual as such. In other words, in a cocoon, right? You have to take everything into consideration as you develop ideas, as you deal with ideas, so that they have a context. Otherwise, it looks phony. My tío also told me about an occasion when in 1921 there was a big flood in San Antonio. I don't know if they've had a bigger flood since then. But he told me that, and I put this almost word for word in the book, that it got so high that it reached 6 o'clock on this big clock in San Antonio on Commerce Street. You know, they had these huge clocks up at this huge, you know, on a pedestal. And the water rate got up so high that it actually got to 6 o'clock on the clock. To me, that was such an amazing image, you know. And I said it has to go into the book. So, yeah, I think for writing has to be an engagement, you know, with people, with your surroundings, certainly with ideas. And talking to two philosophers, that's what it's all about, right?
Well, I love your description, Armando, because you know I'm finishing translating a book with my son right now on Hegel and his ideas about how his philosophy of state came about, and it's this fusion of historical research and delving into the course of human history, right? Along with a picture that gets developed of very deep personal engagement. And that's what you're explaining to us. You know, you said your stories are based on these historical events, right? Each one respectively. And the research you do to understand these events goes into your reading and writing of the story. But, you know, the dynamic includes your personal relationships with your TO and others, and the reconstruction of your own memories of San Antonio and the Westside. I think is a wonderful fusion that has to come together in a writer, right? Because you have all this welling up in you of these family memories, family resemblances, the history, the roots, that all have to come together when you put your hands on that keyboard or ink to paper.
And influence each other.
And influence each other, right?
And here's
in these back and forth sorts of ways.
Here's another question that we have, Armando. You know, there are different disciplines, you know, to study literature, to study philosophy, but philosophy is also expressed in words, and often in literature we can think of, for instance, Camus, right? Well, I mean, if we go back, right, to Plato in a dialogue, and Camus in plays, Sartre in plays, so much of philosophy has been not in philosophical writing, but in literature. And so I'm just wondering, what do you think? And then you're doing time travel in your books, in your own children's stories, right? So
time travel and history telling.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
Retelling history in a way from these other perspectives, right? From this fresh, I'm just experiencing this perspective from a young adult perspective, right? Because that's what you have to adopt to get these youths, right?
What would you, how do you understand esas fronteras, right? How do you understand those borders between literature and philosophy?
I think they're very, very ephemeral. Maybe I don't know if that's the right word. It's very vague. They're not, there's no really, I would say there's no real distinction. I would say between writing and philosophy. Essentially, the writer is, as I mentioned earlier, they're trying to express a truth as he or she sees it. And I think the philosopher is constantly doing that as well. Now, how he's expressed, I mean, even Plato, he told short stories, basically. The dialogue, the short stories, you know. Conversations between a couple of guys, you know, having some wine, you know, sitting on cushions or whatever, and talking about these, you know, important things. Homer, whoever Homer was a philosopher, you know. He dealt with the real issues, just of courage, of valor, of loyalty, of discrimination among peoples. Because the Trojan War was really, the kind of the West fighting the East. Tremendous, issue there. Tremendous importance of how people can go to war because they're on the other side of the channel, because one of their kind steals a girl, a young woman, and in this case Helen. I think anyone who's read other Greek literature of the time or history of the times knows that was going on all the time. It was not a big deal, for one tribe to steal the women or even the men of other tribes. It just happened, But it's like today we have people who look for an excuse to start a war. And the devastation can be incredible now. It was then, Troy was destroyed basically. But one guy got away, Aeneas, and he took that culture and founded Rome. And who took over later on from the Greeks? Rome. So there's a whole, there's a whole loop there of just realities, and we can talk probably quite a while about what are the realities of that literature speaks of, or the poetry. And I tried my hand at poetry. I published a little chapbook, and I haven't really had the time or I don't know about the inclination, but a lot of it is time. But again, what to write about, and I haven't come up with something that kind of drives me that I can hang on to as a writer, and helps propel me toward producing something. I think that's part of it too, Jules. Of not just wanting to write, but being propelled to write. Mm-hmm. Being drawn by the whole process of it, the whole almost adventure of it and challenge of it, to put words down on paper or on the screen. Mm-hmm. Like I say, once I'd gotten the premise for the first book and it started to come together, and then I finished it. I actually finished it. I had another story to write,
Right.
and I wrote that within within a year, maybe less. And the same with the other books. Came along.
This one philosopher I work with, his name's Franz Rosenzweig, a German Jewish philosopher, and he takes up this concept from Kant about the genius. Kant and other idealists were working with this idea of genius, right? The way Rosenzweig tells it is that in order to come up with a work of art, a creation, right? To create a work of art, one has to have all these influences from one's world, from one's relations, right? And they all have to come together. But it doesn't mean that you're a writer yet until you produce the work, right? And you said when you finally achieve that first work, and then the other ones just tumbled out, right? And so then you've achieved this almost second birth as a different sort of human being. You're a writer, and you write works, right? I think you described that. I recognized what was going on in your description there, and how Rosenzweig also talked about a very similar process. That in producing this piece of literature, a novel.
It's almost like you're pregnant with it.
Exactly.
Or you need to give birth to this truth.
Yeah.
This is how you said the writer, and this
That's
is
right.
this is one of the things that I wanted to get your opinion on. The question is, what do writers think about the truth? You specifically are saying that there's a truth that I want to convey. I'm saying, I'm thinking like in terms of the Chicano Manifesto, right? Like that perspective, that truth had not been articulated yet. And this was in conjunction with that, right? The other question we had for you is, what do you think drives a person to write? Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, with respect to the Chicano Manifesto, up until 1969 or so, I had been a reporter, a weekly newspaper. I had worked for the Public Affairs Office at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And I had never even dreamed of writing a book. Or maybe I had, but, it was way in the future. But it turned out that I found myself in the middle of a movement. And I recognized it as a movement. Other people did. I wasn't the only one. But at some point, I'm pretty sure that I came to the conclusion that it was something to write about, and somebody should be writing the story, what's going on. And as I often do, I was talking to myself about it, and I said, Rendon, why don't you write it? And I said, okay, why not? It wasn't as simple as that or as goofy, but I did realize, and it was pretty risky, because I knew that if I started it, if I even got a publisher, that the book would either come out a big flop or a big success, or somewhere in between. But again, I was driven by circumstances that were bigger than myself, obviously. I had a lot of information because I had been out in California, Texas, New Mexico, Maryland, Texas, of course, Midwest, and I've been meeting people like Cesar Chavez, Jose Gutierrez, and Rocky Gonzalez, all the big names of that time. I should mention Dolores Huerta too. She was always there, along with Cesar. But I think that it was also the force of the movement, that I guess gave me the guts to even consider writing a book. And in this particular volume, it just came out. It struck me that I had all this information, I met all these people, and I actually wrote the book in about 4 months. But I think the first full draft took me about 4 months. And after that, it was obviously cleaning it up and working with an editor. The Macmillan Company picked it up, thank goodness. But again, in terms of the ideas, originally I started to consider writing a pretty much journalistic type of book. This happened and that happened and so that sort of thing. The more I got into it, the more I realized that I had changed. Right, my own zeitgeist. I use the word zeitgeist, and I saw that as I love that word. I'm not sure I know what it means, but it's zeitgeist. I love it. But my viewpoint of what's going on changed. I had become a Chicano. Right? I'd been a sort of a Mexican American before that. But the movement itself caused me to evolve, and then writing the book that kind of solidified it, right? So I realized that there was not just activism and protests and this sort of thing going on, but that a whole part of the world was becoming more aware of itself. And once you become aware of yourself, you start asking questions. the big questions. Why am I here? Why are we being treated like this? Why are we different? Is it because some other people tell us we're different and therefore we don't belong? We don't deserve the same rights as other people, and so on, right? So the questions just develop as we become more aware of ourselves and our status, let's say, in society. I realized that I was more or less secure as a writer, right? But not as a person, not as an individual with this newfound identity. And it makes all the difference, I think, as a writer, that you yourself are pretty secure in who you are. Otherwise, I think this is true of any kind of writer. Not all writing is thoughtful or worth going out and buying a book about it. But I think all writing has to come from somewhere, and in many cases, it comes from one's experiences. The whole communal element or parts of writing. In this case, it was a whole people that was changing and views that were changing. People were dying because of it. A good friend of mine died in the Chicano moratorium in 1979. I'm sorry, 69. Ruben Salazar. That had a tremendous impact on me. And meeting the people that were actually out literally in the fields, or in the streets, that gave me a whole different perspective on who I was and what I should be writing about. And certainly at that moment. So Chicano Manifesto was a result of that whole experience, And I think having gotten the kind of education I did at St. Mary's, it allowed me to be able to synthesize all of that, to ask questions of myself particularly, because it's a very personal book too. There's a lot in it that is me. So it's I guess on different levels, it strikes at different aspects of just our humanity, and certainly my humanity. 50 years later, this is the 50th anniversary edition, this guy here, right? I'm still around to talk about it, and I'm surprised as heck.
And the nice thing about that, Armando, is, it touched a different dimension of humanity in yourself. But the reason why the book is 50 years still going strong after 50 years is it's resonating in the humanity of others too, right? So you're speaking on a different level from human to human with a work like that. That's invested with so much of your own spirit and the spirit of the time, right? So
Yeah.
you're not just surveying something like a journalist may, right? And I'm not impugning that at all, right? But you were involved in the suffering and loss, as you said, and also the growth in identification of this people, of your people, of the Chicanos.
Jules, out of the three, he knows the most German out of us, right? So the word is Zeitgeist.
Yeah, Zeitgeist.
And it's the spirit of the times.
The spirit of the times, right? The ethos of the time. You were able to catch the pulse of that because you became one with it in some ways, right? And in that way you could express it. Then it's a true expression, right? So we're talking about truth here, right? A true expression because it's vibrating through you in some way.
Well, the interesting thing is that 50 years later, I'm still concerned that there's a lessening of what interest of a of where we belong as a people, Mexican Americans. And and I came to, and strangely enough, here I'm talking about the 50th anniversary edition of this book, but I was drawn to write something more as an essay. But in 2018, when I saw so many 50th anniversaries taking place all over the place, 50th anniversary of this event, of so and so, of this and that, and I actually went to a conference in San Antonio in November 2018. That was the 50th anniversary of the first hearing by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights on Mexican American civil rights and issues, where they held a formal hearing, first of its kind. And I wasn't there because I was very new with the commission at the time. But here I was 50 years later or so, going to a conference celebrating that time, and not much has changed. There's some, increase in how much wealth there is among Mexican American businesses, PhDs, and so forth and so on. But we as a people still continue to be considered by many as second class, as faux citizens, as immigrants. And yet it kind of galls me when somebody says, well, we're a nation of immigrants. Well, what about the people that are already here? What do you call them? And essentially Mexican Americans were here. And our ancients go back to the Chica, the Maya, the Inca, those peoples. So how do you address that? And out of that conference came this paper called The Blueprint for the Next 50 Years. And essentially, it goes through a litany of human values that, from my point of view, and for Mexican Americans, only address or only affect Mexican Americans. That only Mexican Americans, and I write this in, you can read the blueprint. It's in this book, so you can buy a copy of it. Or you can go to Chicano's 2070 website, chicanos2070.com, and read it there too. But I discerned that there were at least 6 major concerns that face Mexican Americans. And these are the type of things that, like I said, only affect us. Only we can address them, because only we can benefit from dealing with these issues. And as I say, if we don't, no one else is going to care. There's not going to be anybody coming over the horizon to save our culture and our history and so forth, and our literature. So that was, that again was part of a whole process. And maybe it was over 50 years that, it finally dawned on me that, again, somebody has to say that. And I think it's the philosopher's duty to point those kind of issues out. I think at one time they were called prophets, but that's kind of an old hat type of thing. But I think philosophers need to tell the world maybe what's wrong with it, or what's right with it, or how we can do things better. But in my case, I really thought that it was time to point these things out, and they all have to do with identity. Who we are. I personally think that the future not only of Mexican Americans but of the Americas depends on a stronger attachment, or revisiting, rejuvenating, reviving our indigeneity. And I really mean that in terms of certainly Chicanos and other indigenous peoples in the Americas, but for everybody in general. I think that's really what's going to save this world. But there's also a need to be able to tell our story. There is a narrative that Mexican Americans need to pick up and become, not only knowledgeable about, but be comfortable in talking about who we are. And then just the very nature of our indigeneity has to cause us to align ourselves in greater, more definitely, with other indigenous peoples in the Americas and in the rest of in the United States and in the Americas as well. And that's why I chose the next 50 years, starting in 2020, as a period of time where, as you know, the ancients also had that concept of every 52 years of renewing a new age, a new epoch come about. But we can't start preparing for the 2070 unless we do something now. So that's what I was trying to point out in that essay. And as you mentioned, Kim, it did lead to the formation of a group called Mexicanos 2070.
Yeah, it's been my experience when I have ideas that I want to write. I don't know about you, but you're reminding me of this, that I think, but like, doesn't everybody already know this? Isn't it obvious? Because it's obvious to me, but fortunately, I've had really great mentors that tell me, no, it's not obvious to everybody. You need to write it. And so they encourage me to write it, and they keep publishing them. So I guess it's, so I guess it's this truth that we feel like it's true and obvious to us, but it's not obvious to everybody. And so hence.
Yeah, well, and part of what is unique about your story, Armando, as a writer, are these different audiences and the different way you have to speak truth to them. The truth as you're seeing it. And I think it's a marvelous story because, there's, in one way, you can reach a certain kind of readership or audience writing a political treatise, right, or a manifesto. Mm-hmm. But you're reaching a much different audience and spreading truth, or the truth of history in some ways, in a much different way with Noldo and his magic scooter, right? Scooting around the barrio.
Another frontera that I find very interesting is the aesthetic border with the political. And there's other philosophers who go back and forth on this. I think, for instance, I know Alain Locke, a philosopher, African-American philosopher, and then W.E.B. Du Bois had this interchange between whether we should use the arts to convey a political message, and W.E.B. Du Bois said, yes, we should. And Alain Locke said, no, because then it limits the freedom of the artist to be an artist and just do whatever. It doesn't have to have a purpose. It doesn't have to have a political purpose. The politics limit it. What are your thoughts on that, Armando?
I personally think that the arts can do whatever they want. People that are artistic can do whatever the hell they want. And from the standpoint of a writer, if you don't use your writing for, good, talk about a philosophical.
Whatever good means, right?
What is good? But you can't, if you can't use, at least to be truthful to yourself and to your own art, right? It can take whatever, the message can be whatever you want. And in some cases, I can't think of it right now, but the pieces of works of art, poems, whatnot, have had different reactions at different times in terms of what their meaning is. People take what they want out of a piece of art, right? Guernica is the painting by Picasso. I think it's maybe an example that it has more relevance right now, perhaps, than it did 20, 30 years ago, in terms of what's going on, in Europe. Again, someone who thinks they can control as much of the world as they want to, or they can, is using the most outrageous and inhumane methods to achieve that. What do we say about that as philosophers or writers or artists, sculptors? If you don't use that art to convey truths or to bring out where wrong is taking place, then you're not being true to your art, because you're not letting it look at the world and come to some conclusions about it that you may be for violence, you may be against it. I think most artists be against it because what's one of the first things that are destroyed in war, if not works of art? The poets that have been killed, Garcia Lorca, he, in terms of zeitgeist, I think he expressed his time as well as anyone. But he ended up getting killed for it, and apparently his body's never been found. That's the ultimate sacrifice of the artist, I think, to his or her art. Yeah, I don't think you can, differentiate or set aside an artist and do just art. What the heck? What does that mean? How can you just do art if it's not meaningful? If that doesn't, touch us somehow? And you know that every time that, even reading something, looking at a painting, sculpture, a movie, and you're moved by it, that something coming, it's like a connection is being made, between people, between minds, and between reader and writer. That is rather vital to the human soul.
That's a wonderful way to describe. Again, I'm being the commentator here. It seems like you're the way that you approach writing in all its different forms, because what you're doing is you're bringing to life perhaps some neglected parts of other humans, right? They're hearing your story, and you're able then, as a writer, to renew a kind of renewed humanity, or a sense for humanity. As you were talking, I was thinking of a couple of very interesting correlations. One of them was from this journalist philosopher named Walter Benjamin. I don't know if you've heard of him. He committed suicide when he was trying to flee from the Nazis. He wrote that when aesthetics becomes politicized, that's when you have this opening the door widely for fascism and the violence of fascism. So once you politicize that and take away that kind of freedom of expression that you were talking about, for the artist to develop freely in whatever way, right? And you take that away from the artist, that's when the destructive violence can occur, right? Because that's what you do as an artist, as a writer, as a writing literature. You're freely expressing this story to make a point or a truth, but it's still coming out of this free expression by you. You're not being forced to do this or that.
Well, we have a classic example in Socrates. He probably irritated a lot of people in his time just by asking questions,
Right.
right? Mostly because he never had, never came up with an answer. But in that case, he was forced to quote, commit suicide, taking poison, because of his lack of, or inability, I guess more than that, he just refused to go along with the rest of the crowd and follow the party line and so forth, Yeah, that's a classic example of the artist or the philosopher staying true to one's perspective, one's outlook, one's desire for learning the truth or truths. There isn't just one truth. Am I right?
The truth as it's imparted to each one of us.
Yeah,
Right. That's a nice one.
Yeah.
It's a nice way to put it. And it's at this point, I think we have to begin to wrap up because we're
Yes.
getting signs from
the universe.
from the universe
Yeah, right.
that it's time.
That it is truly
It is
the time
time.
in our time travel, in our true time travel. So thank you so much, Armando, for taking the time through this journey with us. And thank you to our viewers, our production team. My name is Kim Diaz.
My name's Jules Simon.
This has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. Please join us next time.
See you then.